Some of you may have been here 10 days ago when we titled Evensong Banners of Change. It was in honor of the Social Justice Sewing Academy, whose work has been featured on our gun violence altar. We were joined by the Academy's founder and executive director, Sarah Trail. Now, she's something of a star in the sewing world, and having joined at a young age, she was once content to follow the crafts conventions. That was all overturned and changed in 2012 when Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black youth armed with only Skittles and an iced tea, was shot and killed in Central Florida. Sarah, then an undergrad at Cal Berkeley, was riven by the injustice, and she channeled her outrage into her art, crafting a stunning quilt in Trayvon Martin's likeness and honor. Now, there were established businesses that had once showcased her work, but they rejected this new piece and its themes, and Sarah found herself at odds with a lifelong community. Like Jeremiah, called as a youth to witness against violent conquest, like Jeremiah, who was barred from the inner sanctum, Sarah was moved. She was called into action. A new mission was born for her, one that would take her across the country, gathering students from Dorchester, Massachusetts, the south side of Chicago, and myriad other communities that are heavily impacted by gun violence, gathering them to make quilts. Now, of course, the resistance to this idea was not limited to national retailers. It was a leap of faith for some of those young people, too. There was one youth who rebuffed Sarah and sort of dismissed the staying power of a needle and thread, and Sarah reminded him exactly how quickly his graffiti painted around the corner would be painted over. He took her point and got to work on his own contribution to the quilt. To go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together, Sarah reminded us. Like the complex and interlocking forces that perpetuate gun violence and its attendant trauma, the process of memorializing it in a quilt is no simple matter. So the concepts were first designed by the youth themselves, but then there are these multiple phases: cutting, pressing, sewing, pinning, backing, quilting, binding, finishing, and embroidering, with as many as 50 volunteers involved in producing a single quilt. And the quilts are inspired by youth, inspired by the trauma they have witnessed and experienced, but that is not their limit or their end. In today's gospel, we meet a woman and we're told that she has been quite unable to stand up straight for 18 long years. Hunched over, bound by the accuser, inflicted with some spirit of infirmity, we have to assume it's not only standing up straight that's difficult. Her whole body was strained. Most of life was difficult. And Sabbath rest was elusive. When Jesus heals her, the text tells us that she is at last able to stand up straight. And paradoxically, this means that she is also able to lie in rest and to lay down those things that have burdened her over 18 years, a symbolic lifetime. Now, the text gives little insight into the reasons for her infirmity, at least not reasons that our modern ears can latch onto. So when I was researching this gospel, I discovered a volley in a blog between two scripture scholars, one of whom had consulted with a psychiatric nurse. And that nurse identified being unable to stand up straight as a common symptom of a certain kind of trauma. And my conjecture from their comments is that this is heightened by childhood trauma. So perhaps literally, but at least symbolically, this woman bears in her body her own community's inability to protect a child of Abraham from harm, or to restore her to her rightful place among them. It is a story of healing. But the gospel presents this story in the context of Jesus going to the synagogue to teach. So it also serves as an illustration on the themes of binding and freeing. I think it's fair to say that we are predisposed by our national and legal climates to understand binding and freeing as opposites, and to understand freedom in terms of individual rights that are nearly absolute and protected by the state. But in our scriptures, and here exemplified in Jesus' teaching, in his healing and way of life, binding and freeing are really two sides of the same coin. When the woman is set free from her 18-year ailment, her bonds to the divine, to her community, and to herself are renewed. The same and its converse are true for us. When we are free, in the theological sense of that term, it assumes a bond to the holy. And like Mary, Jesus' mother, who in the Magnificat says, "Here am I, a bondswoman of the Lord." It is a bond to life that is freely chosen. It is choosing God, choosing the well-being of God's creation. But when we are bound, when we are unfree in the theological sense of that term, we are held captive by fear, attachment, acquisition, or power, by addiction, illusion, or violence. And then we cannot freely choose God, or choose life, or choose one another. You know, as I've been praying these texts this week, I've had a little bit of an earworm from James Taylor and his song, "Shed a Little Light." There's a line in it that says, "We are bound together. We're bound together by the task that stands before us and the road that lies ahead. We are bound, and we are bound." This week, our Vice Dean Greg Kimura and I, along with a team of staff and congregants, will cross into Tijuana to see firsthand the conditions on the border. Our time there will be guided primarily by the staff of Pila Global, a well-regarded nonprofit that has established nests, or centers of learning for children ages 10 or younger. Those nests are located right next to where refugee centers are, and they use emotionally appropriate forms of pedagogy for children who have suffered trauma. It's fair to say that we go to Tijuana not as sightseers, but as pilgrims and ambassadors, seeking insight into those intersections of the deep needs just south of our state and this cathedral's mission and passion. We do not know the task that stands before us. That's the work of discernment. But we know that we can be freely bound together, that freely binding ourselves together can mitigate and prevent the cycles of violence and trauma. Whatever the task is, whatever our call is, let's choose to embrace it with a soft touch, that soft touch of Jesus, that soft touch exemplified by Sarah Trail, to provide the backing and the binding and the embroidery that helps a person, their trauma, their bondage, their freedom, and their release find its place in the storied tapestry of humankind. Let's choose a soft touch, because the difference between a young prophet who calls out the violence and one who collapses under its weight might quite literally lie in our hands.